Hey class, welcome back to American Revolution and our history subject. We're going to be jumping into chapter 11, the colonies resist. Before we get into chapter 11, what did we talk about in chapter 10? And if you haven't watched chapters 1 through 10 or haven't read them, please do that because each chapter builds on the previous one. Chapter 10, we talked about the Boston Tea Party and how thankfully, with the Committee of Correspondence, news was spread throughout the colonies that British ships were coming with tea. That, remember, they lowered the cost of tea, but they still had the tea tax. But the total cost, even with the tax, was less than the Dutch tea that was being smuggled in. But we learned that the colonists didn't really care about how much the tea cost. They cared about taxation without representation. And so they weren't going to buy that tea, and they weren't even going to let that tea be unloaded. And so on December 16th, 1773, what happened? A group of colonists dressed themselves up as Native Americans, and they boarded those ships. And they threw all those tea chests, I think it was 340, let's see if I can remember, 300 and something, 342 sea chests into the harbor. Nothing else was ruined. They even cleaned up after they were done. And they did that to show that Parliament could not do and rule like they were. And so this tension between the colonies and the mother country of Great Britain is really rising and growing. So now the colonies are resisting. That's where we're learning more. We just talked about this. Resisting means to go against. We learned that in chapter 10. So remember, you can get extra credit if you create your own sentence using one of the vocabulary words. Remember to do the chapter vocabulary words in the big question. Please do not copy and paste your answer for the big question. Please use your own words, and that will give you the opportunity to get full credit. All right. So let's dive into chapter 11. The colonies resist. Oh, sorry. First, let's do the big question. Almost forgot that. Let's read that together. How did colonists' attitudes and view of themselves begin to change? So we have learned that at first, the colonists didn't really want to separate. They liked being under British rule. They liked having the mother country. There was a small group that realized that for them to thrive and for them to become what they could, they needed to be independent of the mother country. And now with Parliament doing all these, unlawful taxes, or, just using their authority, too much, more colonists are deciding that this is not right and that the group of resistance is growing. All right, so help from other colonies. Parliament was right about one thing. The intolerable acts made the people of Boston and the rest of Massachusetts suffer. However, Parliament didn't expect the other colonies to come to their aid. Pennsylvania sent barrels of flour to the people of Massachusetts. New York sent sheep. South Carolina sent sacks of rice. Connecticut sent money. Virginia sent corn and wheat. So, the intolerable acts, Parliament was trying to punish Massachusetts, right? And it was working, but the colonies are coming together as unified people. And so other states or other colonies are sending the things that Massachusetts needs. So they're unifying together. Virginia's leaders even went a step further. They set aside a day of fasting and prayer for the people of Boston. They also declared that the intolerable acts were a threat to liberty in every colony. If the king and parliament could do these things to Massachusetts, what would stop them from doing the same to other colonies? Right? What would stop them? Probably nothing, right? Only if they stand together. So this is throughout the colonies, there was a determination to help the people of Boston. They were becoming the United States or the United Colonies, right? The Virginians took a bold step. They called for delegates from all the colonies to meet and discuss what to do next. This would be the second time delegates met to resist an act of Parliament. Remember, to go against the Act of Parliament. The first time the Stamp Act Congress had been successful. This time, though, the British government seemed determined not to back down. The First Continental Congress. In 1774, 56 colonial leaders met in Philadelphia. They represented 12 of the 13 British colonies in North America. Only Georgia did not send delegates. The colonists thought this meeting was important. We can tell by the delegates they chose. George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson represented Virginia. Sam Adams and his cousin John represented Massachusetts. New York sent John Jay. Jay later served on the Supreme Court of the United States. Let's pause really quick. That's our first vocabulary word. Our vocabulary phrase, Supreme Court, is the highest court in the land. So we still have the Supreme Court today. John Adams wrote in his diary, there is in the Congress a collection of the greatest men upon this continent. This meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. The delegates discussed their common problems. They shared their anger at the British government. They issued a Declaration of Rights. All right, so a declaration is a formal statement. Remember to use the vocabulary definitions from the book. And then when you're answering the big question, please do not copy and paste your answer. Please use your own words. So the declaration said that as British colonists, they were entitled to all the rights of Englishmen. They listed the ways Parliament had taken their rights away since the French and Indian War. They also told King George III that the colonists were still loyal to him. They asked him to consider their complaints. So even right now, they're still not trying to totally cut their ties with Parliament in the mother country. They're trying to get this to work, but they're realizing that things are not working out well, for both parties, really. And so they're trying to figure out if they can solve this together. Look at these two pictures. So George Washington right here on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right attended the First Continental Congress. So the First Continental Congress did two more things. It voted to stop all trade with British until Parliament repealed the Intolerable Acts. So until Parliament removed the laws, colonists would buy nothing from Britain and sell nothing to Britain. So they're stopping all trade between themselves and the mother country. The Congress also agreed to meet again in May 1775 if Parliament still had not given their rights back. So they're planning for their contingency plan. If things do not go well, we're going to meet again and see what we need to do. A new identity. The First Continental Congress and the Declaration of Rights were the most defiant actions the colonies had ever taken. So let's pause. And defiant means breaking the rules on purpose. So they are breaking the rules, the rules and the laws given to them from the mother country on purpose. They're trying to make things right. But something more than defiance had happened. This something had no exact name. There was no exact date when it started. Still, it was as important as any of the resolutions passed by the First Continental Congress. So a resolution is a final decision usually meant to solve a problem or create a course of action. So there's this resolution that doesn't have an exact date when it started, but it's as important as anything else that has been passed. Maybe it started with those shipments of flour and rice and money to Boston from the other colonies. Maybe it began with the Stamp Act Congress. Maybe it had been happening all along, before anyone was aware of it. That something was that the colonies were coming together as never before. We kind of just talked about, right? This intolerable acts were punishing Massachusetts, but there was this something that was bringing the colonies together. Before this, each colony had thought of itself as a separate from the others. The colonists thought of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or Georgians. When they thought of an attachment to any other place, it was to Great Britain. That was partly because each colony had more to do with Britain than it did with other colonies. It was also due to the fact that the colonists thought of themselves as British citizens with all the rights of Englishmen. So we can see that these are the 13 colonies, and if we read this caption, it says, the colonists began to think themselves as Americans, not as members of the 13 separate colonies. When they first got here, they thought themselves as independent, like they thought that they were just part of Britain, but then to themselves. They didn't really relate or unify with those that were south or north of them. But now they are becoming united. They're becoming the United Colonies, right? The Americans. So by the end of the First Continental Congress, many colonists were thinking of themselves as part of one country, not as a people living in 13 different colonies. They were more aware of things they had in common. They were more aware that they needed each other. Patrick Henry summed up the new awareness perfectly. Summed up the new awareness perfectly. He told the First Continental Congress, the differences, right? The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. And that is it for chapter 11. Just want to double check. Okay, so that was an awesome chapter. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Before we end, if you guys want some help, I'll give some pointers and tips about your big question. All right, so the big question: how did colonists' attitudes and view of themselves begin to change? So the colonists were unhappy with the Intolerable Acts, right? It had reached a point of no return when it came to Great Britain. So previously, most colonists wanted to resolve the conflict between who? They wanted to make things work between the colonists and who, right? So that's a little hint. But then by the time of the First Continental Congress, what we just read about, many of them viewed themselves as what? Not dependent on Great Britain, but what? So for the first time, the colonies began to view themselves as what? They used to view themselves as a part of Great Britain and the British Empire, but now they're viewing themselves not as just Virginians or New Yorkers, but as what? So those are some hints and some points that you should be hitting upon when you're answering the big question. But that is it for chapter 11. I will see you guys in chapter 12. See ya.